The air inside the police station was thick with the scent of stale coffee and cheap disinfectant, a blend that clung to the walls and floors like a permanent stain. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, casting a harsh, sterile glow on everything beneath them. Behind the front desk, officers moved with the kind of relaxed arrogance that came from knowing they were untouchable, their voices carrying in low, casual tones as they swapped stories and sipped from their dented travel mugs. None of them spared a second glance at the woman sitting on the hard, metal chair in the holding area, her wrists still marked from the tightness of the cuffs they had just removed. But she saw them. She saw everything. Her name was Valerie Brooks, and she was not a woman who frightened easily. She had been through too much in her 53 years of life to be rattled by a couple of overzealous, racist cops. But this was something different. This wasn't just about her. This was about every time she had walked into a store and been watched like a criminal, every time she had spoken up in a meeting and been ignored, every time she had been forced to swallow her pride and let things slide for the sake of peace. And now, here she was, treated like a fraud in front of a room full of strangers, because the idea of a black woman withdrawing a large sum of money from her own account was apparently too much for some people to accept. She glanced down at her hands, flexing her fingers, the soreness from the cuffs still lingering. She exhaled slowly, steadying herself. They thought she was just another person they could intimidate, another statistic, another case that would get lost in the system. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Outside the station, the city of Atlanta pulsed with life, the streets bustling with people going about their evening routines. The sky was a soft shade of indigo, the last remnants of daylight fading into the skyline. This was her city. She had lived here her entire life, built her career here, raised her family here. And now, after everything, she found herself in this place, waiting in a dimly lit room for them to decide what they were going to do with her. Officer Travis Wilkes leaned against the counter, smirking as he scrolled through his phone. He was the kind of cop who got off on power, who liked the feeling of watching people squirm under his authority. His partner, Ethan Reynolds, stood a few feet away, filling out paperwork with the kind of casual indifference that came with routine. To them, this was nothing. Just another arrest, another black woman in cuffs, another day on the job. Valerie had seen their type before. Men who wore their badges like shields, not to protect, but to dominate. Men who had learned early in life that the rules bent in their favor, and they used that knowledge like a weapon. Wilkes finally pushed away from the counter, striding toward her with an exaggerated sigh. "So," he drawled, slipping his phone into his pocket. "You want to tell us what you were really doing in that bank? Because I gotta say, lady, it doesn't look good for you." Valerie lifted her gaze slowly, meeting his eyes without a shred of fear. "You already know what I was doing," she said evenly. "I was withdrawing my money. Legally. With my ID. But you weren't interested in that, were you?" Wilkes chuckled, shaking his head. "See, that's where you're wrong. We're very interested. In fact, we're so interested that we're making sure we check every little detail before we let you go. Fraud's a serious crime, you know." She clenched her jaw, forcing herself to stay calm. They wanted her angry. They wanted her to snap, to give them an excuse to escalate things. She wasn't going to give them the satisfaction. Reynolds, still at the desk, yawned loudly. "I dunno, Wilkes," he muttered. "She doesn't really look like she's got much fight in her. Maybe we just let her sit there for a while, see if she changes her story." Wilkes shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe she starts remembering where she really got that money from. Could be interesting." Valerie inhaled deeply, her patience stretching thin. These men weren't just corrupt, they were enjoying this. They were relishing the humiliation, the way they could twist a situation to suit their own narratives. She let a slow, deliberate smile creep across her lips. "You're making a mistake," she said quietly. Wilkes snorted. "Oh yeah? And why's that?" She leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough to make him lean in as well. Because you arrested the wrong woman. Reynolds scoffed from the desk, shaking his head. That's cute. But Wilkes hesitated. There was something in her tone, something that made his smirk falter just a fraction. She tilted her head, eyes locked onto his. You might want to answer the phone when it rings. Because when it does, it won't be for me. Wilkes frowned. He opened his mouth, maybe to snap back with another condescending remark, but before he could, the phone at the front desk rang. Loud. Sharp. Cutting through the thick, stagnant air of the station like a blade. Reynolds looked over at the phone, then at Wilkes, then back at the phone. The room suddenly felt smaller, the easy arrogance that had filled it just seconds ago thinning like smoke. The officer behind the desk picked up the call, his posture stiffening as he listened to whatever was being said on the other end. His brows knit together, confusion flickering across his face before something else, something that looked an awful lot like fear, began to settle in. Valerie didn't move. Didn't blink. She just sat there, watching, waiting. The officer cleared his throat, glancing toward Wilkes. Yeah, he muttered into the receiver. She's here. Yes, sir. Right away. Wilkes straightened, glancing at Valerie as if seeing her for the first time. She arched a brow. Something wrong, officer? Wilkes clenched his jaw, the muscles ticking beneath his skin. He didn't answer. But Valerie already knew. The game had just changed. And these men? They were about to learn exactly what it felt like to be on the wrong side of power. Police officers, 2 of them, walk into the bank with casual arrogance, their uniforms crisp, their badges gleaming under the fluorescent lights. She's already standing at the counter, holding her ID, her bank card, and the withdrawal slip she just signed. The teller, a young white woman with a stiff, uneasy expression, keeps glancing between the screen and the woman in front of her, her fingers hesitating on the keyboard. The air feels thick, heavy with something unsaid. The woman shifts her weight slightly, sensing the change in atmosphere, sensing the hostility radiating from the employees behind the counter, sensing that something is wrong. Then, the words land like a slap. I'm sorry, ma'am, but we can't process this transaction. This account, it doesn't match your profile. The teller's voice is clipped, suspicious. The woman frowns, her gaze unwavering. Excuse me. This is my account. Here's my ID. I've been banking here for years. She gestures to the screen, where her name and details are clearly displayed, but the teller doesn't look at it. She looks at the officers instead, and suddenly, the woman's stomach twists. One of them, a tall officer with narrowed eyes, steps forward. We got a report that someone's trying to withdraw money fraudulently, he says, his voice filled with smug certainty. That someone matches your description. She laughs, a bitter, disbelieving sound, shaking her head. Are you serious? My description? Because I'm black. Because I have money in my own damn account. The second officer, shorter but stockier, crosses his arms. Ma'am, lower your voice. We're just doing our job. The words send a pulse of rage through her veins. Doing their job. Their job is to protect and serve, not to humiliate and accuse innocent people. She turns to the teller, hoping for some kind of intervention, some level of common sense, but the young woman shrinks back. The decision has already been made. You need to come with us, the taller officer says, reaching for his cuffs. Her breath catches. What? No. No, I'm not going anywhere. I didn't do anything. The officer grabs her wrist, twisting it roughly behind her back. Pain shoots up her arm, and she stumbles, the world spinning as the cold metal of the handcuffs bites into her skin. Gasps ripple through the bank. Some people whisper, others pull out their phones, recording, but no one steps in. No one stops this from happening. You're under arrest for attempted fraud, the officer says, his tone bored, like this is just another routine arrest, like this is nothing. Her heart pounds violently against her ribs, not out of fear, but out of fury. Her pulse roars in her ears, drowning out everything but the humiliation pressing down on her like a crushing weight. She lifts her chin, refusing to let them see her break. "Call my son," she says, her voice steady despite the fire burning in her chest. The officer chuckles, amused. "And who's your son, ma'am? Some wannabe lawyer?" She stares at him, unblinking. "He's FBI." For the first time, the smugness flickers. It's brief, barely there, but she sees it, the hesitation, the moment of doubt. They drag her outside anyway. They shove her into the back of the squad car. They take her to the station, process her like a criminal, take her fingerprints, snap her mugshot. They sit her in a cold, hard chair in an interrogation room, leaving her alone with nothing but the sound of the ticking clock. She waits. She waits because she knows what's coming. She waits because justice is about to hit these officers harder than they ever thought possible. But how far will the consequences go? And what happens when the power dynamic shifts completely? At Plough of Twist, we stand firmly against racism, discrimination, and injustice in any form. This story highlights the painful reality of racial profiling, but it also showcases strength, resilience, and justice. To every Black viewer watching, you matter, your voice matters, and your experiences are valid. No one should ever face mistreatment because of the color of their skin. Now, get ready for an emotional and powerful story. If you believe in justice and love a good twist, subscribe to the channel and hit the like button. Let's dive in. Enjoy the story. The silence inside the precinct thickened, heavy with an unease that no one dared to name yet. The officer at the desk cleared his throat and shot a nervous glance toward Wilkes, who, for the first time since bringing Valerie in, looked uncertain. The arrogance, the smug amusement that had clung to him like a second skin was beginning to crack, just slightly, just enough for Valerie to see the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He masked it quickly, but it was there. And she saw it. She saw all of it. Wilkes clenched his jaw, standing straighter, his hands balling into fists at his sides as if sheer force could stop whatever was about to happen. He was trying to regain control, trying to pretend that phone call hadn't shaken something loose inside of him. But Valerie knew better. She had seen men like him her entire life, men who relied on their positions of power to shield them from consequences, men who never had to answer for their actions, men who had no idea what it felt like to truly fear for what was coming next. The officer at the desk cleared his throat again, more forcefully this time. Wilkes, you might wanna, take this one in private." Wilkes' nostrils flared slightly, but he nodded, his boots heavy on the linoleum as he walked toward the back office. Reynolds cast a glance toward Valerie, something between annoyance and curiosity flashing across his features before he muttered something under his breath and followed. Valerie didn't move. Didn't blink. She just waited. The door to the office clicked shut behind them, and for the first time, the station felt quiet. Too quiet. The other officers, the ones who had been casually chatting, who had been swapping stories, sipping their coffee, pretending not to see what was happening right in front of them, now they were all watching. They could feel the shift, even if they didn't understand it yet. Valerie exhaled slowly, the corners of her lips curling upward just slightly. They didn't understand it yet, but they would. Inside the office, Wilkes pressed the phone against his ear, his fingers gripping the receiver so tightly his knuckles turned white. "Yeah," he said, his voice still edged with forced confidence. "Who is this?" A pause. A silence so sharp it made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. Then, "This is Agent Marcus Brooks. FBI." Wilkes stiffened. He knew that name. Everyone knew that name. Special Agent Marcus Brooks wasn't just some desk jockey. He wasn't some fresh-faced recruit looking to make a name for himself. He was the kind of agent that made people nervous, the kind that turned up in places where careers ended and corruption got exposed. Wilkes swallowed hard. Yeah. Okay. And what can I do for you, Agent Brooks? Another pause. Longer this time. Then, the voice came through the receiver again, low and steady, dripping with the kind of restrained fury that sent a cold, involuntary shudder through Wilkes' spine. You can start by explaining why the hell my mother is sitting in your precinct like a goddamn criminal. Wilkes' mouth went dry. The blood drained from his face so fast he felt lightheaded for a second, his grip tightening around the phone as if that alone could steady him. He opened his mouth, grasping for words, for an explanation, for some way to turn this around. Listen, he started, his voice cracking slightly before he forced it back into something steadier. There was a misunderstanding. The bank, I don't give a damn what the bank said, Marcus cut him off, his voice dropping even lower, lethal now, precise. You had every opportunity to check her identification. You had every opportunity to verify the account. Instead, you chose to humiliate her. You chose to put her in cuffs. You chose to treat her like a suspect instead of a citizen. Wilkes could feel Reynolds shifting beside him, his own unease growing by the second. The room suddenly felt smaller, like the walls were closing in, like the air was too thick to breathe properly. Listen, Wilkes tried again, desperation clawing at the edges of his voice now. We were just following procedure. If we made a mistake, we can fix it. There was silence on the other end for a long, excruciating moment. Then Marcus spoke again, and this time, there was no mistaking the promise in his tone. Oh, you're gonna fix it, he said. And then you're gonna answer for it. The line went dead. Wilkes lowered the phone slowly, his fingers trembling slightly as he placed it back in its cradle. He turned toward Reynolds, who looked just as pale as he felt. Neither of them spoke. Neither of them needed to. The weight of what was about to happen settled between them, heavy and suffocating. Back in the main room, Valerie was still sitting exactly where they had left her. But now, the tension in the station had shifted. Officers who had ignored her before were stealing glances in her direction, their expressions unreadable, their postures stiffer. The door to the office swung open, and Wilkes walked out, his face carefully blank. But his eyes, they weren't the same. There was no smugness now. No arrogance. Just the creeping realization that the floor beneath him was beginning to crack. Valerie lifted a brow, tilting her head slightly. Something wrong, officer? Wilkes didn't answer. He just gestured for Reynolds to unlock the door to the holding area. Reynolds hesitated for a fraction of a second, but then he moved, his hands clumsy as he fumbled with the keys. The door swung open, but Valerie didn't stand. Not yet. Wilkes cleared his throat. You're free to go. Valerie blinked, feigning confusion. Just like that. Wilkes shifted uncomfortably. There was a miscommunication. Valerie let out a slow, amused breath. A miscommunication, she echoed. That's what you're calling this? He clenched his jaw but said nothing. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes never leaving his. And what happens now, officer? Wilkes hesitated, but before he could respond, the door to the precinct swung open with force, and the entire atmosphere inside the station shifted. The sound of heavy boots on the floor. The presence of something far greater than the two men who had thrown their weight around so carelessly just hours before. Valerie smiled, standing up slowly, smoothing out the wrinkles in her blouse as she turned toward the entrance. Because she already knew. The reckoning had arrived. And it was only just beginning. The sound of polished shoes striking the tiled floor echoed through the precinct, each step deliberate, measured, carrying the weight of authority that neither Wilkes nor Reynolds had ever faced before. The room seemed to shrink as three figures entered, two agents in dark suits flanking a man whose presence alone was enough to command attention. Marcus Brooks. He didn't have to announce himself. The air in the station shifted the moment he stepped inside, an invisible force pressing against every officer in the room. Some stiffened instinctively, others averted their eyes, pretending to be focused on their paperwork, their screens, anything but the inevitable confrontation unfolding in front of them. Wilkes felt the back of his neck dampen with sweat. He had seen Brooks in press conferences, had heard his name in hushed conversations, had read the stories about the investigations he had spearheaded, the cases that had led to officers like him being stripped of their badges, their pensions, their futures. But none of those stories had ever felt real, not until now. Marcus stopped just feet away from Wilkes, his dark eyes scanning him with a calm so unnerving it made Wilkes' stomach twist. He didn't look angry. He didn't have to be. There was something far more dangerous in his expression, certainty. The kind of certainty that came from knowing exactly how this was going to end. Wilkes swallowed, forcing himself to straighten his posture, to keep whatever little control he had left. "Agent Brooks," he started, trying to inject authority into his voice, but it came out thinner than he intended. "There's no need for all this. We've already released my mother," Marcus interrupted, his voice smooth but sharp, cutting through the air like a blade. "Finish that sentence, officer. You've already released my mother after unlawfully detaining her. After handcuffing her like a criminal. After dragging her out of a bank in front of strangers. After humiliating her for nothing." Wilkes' jaw clenched, but before he could respond, Marcus turned his gaze toward Valerie, who had remained still, composed, watching everything unfold with an unreadable expression. When their eyes met, something in Marcus' stance softened, just a fraction. A flicker of something only a son could feel when seeing his mother wronged. But he didn't say anything to her. Not yet. His focus snapped back to Wilkes. "You filed a report on her arrest," Marcus continued, his tone flat, matter of fact. "Which means you fabricated probable cause. Which means you falsified details about why she was detained. Which means," he added, tilting his head slightly, "you knowingly committed misconduct under federal law." Wilkes' throat went dry. He could feel Reynolds shifting uneasily beside him, his silence speaking volumes. They both knew this was bad. Worse than bad. We were just following protocol," Reynolds blurted, his voice strained. "The bank called it in, said there was suspicion of fraud. We had to investigate." Marcus cut him a look so sharp it stopped him mid-sentence. "What part of protocol involves making an arrest before verifying the suspect's identity? Before checking the bank's records? Before asking a single damn question?" He let that sit, let the weight of it sink into the air. "No, officer. You weren't following protocol. You were following prejudice. And now, you're going to follow consequences." Wilkes opened his mouth to argue, but before he could, one of the agents beside Marcus stepped forward, a thick folder in his hands. "Agent Brooks," the man said, his voice crisp, professional. "We've concluded our preliminary investigation on Officers Wilkes and Reynolds as requested. The findings are extensive." Wilkes' stomach lurched. "What the hell does that mean?" he demanded, his voice louder than he intended. Marcus didn't so much as blink. "It means your record has officially caught up with you." The agent handed the folder to Marcus, who flipped it open, his eyes skimming the pages. "Multiple complaints filed against you both," he listed, his tone still disturbingly calm. "Excessive force. Racial profiling. Unlawful searches. Witness intimidation. Evidence tampering. And that's just the documented cases." Wilkes' face turned red. "This is bullshit, is it?" Marcus asked, lifting his gaze again. "Because I have statements. I have video evidence. I have testimonies from victims you thought no one would listen to. And as of 30 minutes ago," he continued, stepping even closer, "I have a federal case opened against both of you." Reynolds visibly paled. "Wait. A federal case? No. No, look, this was a misunderstanding. You didn't think you'd get caught, Marcus finished for him, his voice low, lethal. You thought this was just another day, another black person you could throw in a cell without consequences. But you picked the wrong person. And now, you're going to pay for it. Wilkes let out a bitter laugh, his desperation cracking through. You can't just walk in here and end our careers over one damn arrest. Marcus exhaled, slow, measured. You think this is just about my mother? He shook his head. You think this is just about today? No. This is about every person you've ever done this to. Every person who didn't have someone to fight for them. Every case that was buried, every name that never made it past a complaint form. This isn't about one arrest, officer. This is about justice. The room fell deathly silent. Then, the final blow. Officer Wilkes. Officer Reynolds, Marcus said, his voice ringing clear through the precinct. As of this moment, you are both being placed under investigation by the Federal Bureau of Investigation. You are relieved of duty effective immediately. You will surrender your badges, your firearms, and any departmental property in your possession. You are not to leave the state while this investigation is ongoing. And if you attempt to interfere with this process in any way, Marcus leaned in, his voice just above a whisper now, just between them, just enough to make sure they felt every syllable. I will make damn sure you regret it. Wilkes and Reynolds stood frozen, their world crumbling around them, the weight of everything they had done finally crushing them. Valerie slowly rose from her seat. She walked past them without a glance, past the desk where officers now watched with thinly veiled shock, past the doors that had closed behind her just hours ago. The night air hit her skin, cool, steadying. And as she stepped outside, she exhaled, deep, slow, free. Behind her, in that precinct, justice had finally arrived. And it was only the beginning. The precinct had turned into a pressure cooker, the heat of consequences boiling over, consuming everything Wilkes and Reynolds thought they had built. Officers who once carried themselves with unchecked confidence now shifted uncomfortably, their gazes darting between Marcus Brooks, his agents, and the two men whose careers were disintegrating before their eyes. No one spoke. No one moved. The tension in the air was suffocating, pressing against every wall, filling every crack. It was the kind of silence that came before something irreversible, something that no amount of lies, intimidation, or manipulation could undo. Wilkes clenched his fists, his nails digging into his palms so hard they nearly broke the skin. His face was tight with rage, his breaths coming sharp and uneven. The weight of the situation was settling in, slow and unbearable, and for the first time in his entire career, he was on the other side of the power he had wielded so carelessly. He felt it in his bones, in the cold dread pooling in his stomach. He had spent years playing this game, bending the rules, knowing that the system would always protect him. But now? Now he was the one being cornered, the one with no options, no shield to hide behind. You think you can do this to us? Wilkes finally growled, his voice raw with something between fury and panic. You think you can just walk in here and strip us of everything? You don't know how this works, Brooks. You think you're untouchable because you've got a fancy badge and some federal power behind you? He scoffed, shaking his head. That doesn't mean shit in the real world. Marcus didn't react. He didn't flinch, didn't waver. Instead, he took a step forward, his eyes locked onto Wilkes with an intensity that sent a chill through the entire room. The real world, Marcus echoed, his tone dangerously calm. You mean the world where men like you get to terrorize innocent people without consequence? The world where you put people in cuffs for the crime of existing in spaces you don't think they belong? The world where you get to fabricate reports, intimidate witnesses, and walk away with a slap on the wrist? He tilted his head slightly, his gaze never breaking. That's not the real world, officer. That's your world. And it's over. Reynolds finally snapped, his voice tight with desperation. You don't have anything concrete on us. You're bluffing. There's no way you built a case that fast. One of Marcus's agents chuckled under his breath, shaking his head as he crossed his arms. You really don't get it, do you? He muttered. You were being watched long before tonight. You two were a damn case study. Marcus didn't even look at the agent. His focus remained on the men in front of him, on the crumbling facade they were still trying to hold together. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small recorder, holding it up just enough for them to see before pressing play. The room filled with voices, Wilkes' voice, Reynolds' voice. Their own words, their own admissions, recorded from moments ago. Every racist undertone, every abuse of power, every time they dismissed Valerie, mocked her, treated her like she was less than human, it all played back in sharp, damning clarity. Reynolds' face drained of color, his breath hitching. What the, you've been listening to us? Wilkes' voice cracked slightly, his eyes wide with disbelief, with fear that he was barely keeping at bay. You made it easy, Marcus said simply, pocketing the recorder again. You thought no one was paying attention. You thought this would be just another night. Another arrest. Another black person whose voice wouldn't be heard. His eyes darkened, his next words like a slow, deliberate strike. But this time, you picked the wrong person. Wilkes took a step forward, his body tensed like a coiled spring, but before he could even think of doing something reckless, two of Marcus's agents moved in unison, their hands hovering near their weapons, not drawn, not yet, but ready. The message was clear. Any move Wilkes made would be his last as an officer of the law. Reynolds let out a shaky breath, his entire body deflating. Come on, man, he muttered under his breath, glancing at Wilkes like he was hoping for some kind of plan, some way out of this. But there was nothing. No escape, no loophole. Wilkes' jaw tightened, his teeth grinding together so hard it was a wonder they didn't crack. His whole body was burning with rage, with humiliation, with the sickening realization that he wasn't going to talk his way out of this. Marcus let the silence stretch, let them sit in the weight of their own downfall. Then, with the same calm authority he had carried since the moment he walked in, he spoke again. Take off your badges. The words landed like a gunshot in the quiet precinct. Wilkes' entire body stiffened, his breathing shallow. You don't get to tell me to do a damn thing, he spat. You lost that privilege when you put my mother in cuffs, Marcus countered. Now take off your badges. Hand over your weapons. Or I will have my agents remove them for you. For a moment, Wilkes didn't move. Didn't blink. He was shaking with barely contained fury, his pride waging war against reality. He had spent years believing himself untouchable, believing that his badge made him immune. But now, in this moment, with the weight of the FBI crashing down on him, he realized just how powerless he truly was. Reynolds, looking far less defiant, was the first to move. His hands trembled as he reached for the badge pinned to his chest, his fingers fumbling as he unhooked it. He placed it on the desk in front of him with a hollow thud, his gun following seconds later. Wilkes' breath came in ragged bursts, his fists trembling at his sides. But there was no fight left to win. His badge, his gun, his entire identity as a police officer, it was all over. With movement stiff and resentful, he reached up, yanked the badge from his uniform, and slammed it onto the desk with enough force to make the room flinch. Marcus didn't react. He simply nodded, stepping back as his agents moved in to finalize their suspension. You're both under investigation, Marcus said. Pending formal charges. Wilkes' nostrils flared. This isn't over, he growled. Marcus gave him a slow, measured look. No, he said, voice steady. For you, it is. And just like that, it was done. The weight of justice settled into the room, final, absolute. Valerie, who had been silent, watching, processing everything, exhaled softly. Marcus turned to her, his face shifting, the hard edges softening just enough for the exhaustion to show through. He reached for her hand, and she took it, gripping it tight, their fingers lacing together in silent understanding. "Let's go home, Ma," he said gently. She nodded, her strength unshaken. "Let's go." And as they walked out of the precinct, the cool night air washing over them, one thing was clear: justice had finally caught up. And for the first time in a long, long time, Valerie Brooks was free. The drive away from the precinct was silent at first. Valerie sat in the passenger seat of Marcus's sleek black car, her fingers resting lightly on her lap, the imprints of the handcuffs still faintly visible on her wrists. The city lights passed in a blur outside the window, but she wasn't looking at them. She was lost somewhere between exhaustion and quiet contemplation, the weight of the past few hours settling into her bones. Marcus, gripping the wheel with steady hands, stole a glance at her now and then, his jaw tight, his thoughts unreadable. He was angry, she knew that much. Not just at Wilkes and Reynolds, not just at the system that had allowed them to operate unchecked for so long, but at the fact that he hadn't been there sooner. She could feel it in the way his fingers curled tighter around the leather steering wheel, in the controlled way he exhaled every few minutes like he was trying to stop the fire burning inside him from consuming everything in its path. "You don't have to be quiet, baby," she finally said, her voice soft but steady. "Say what's on your mind." Marcus let out a slow breath, shaking his head slightly as he kept his eyes on the road. "What's on my mind," he repeated, voice low, controlled, but carrying an undercurrent of something dangerous. "What's on my mind is that two cops who should have never been wearing badges to begin with put you in cuffs and humiliated you in front of an entire bank full of people like it was just another day for them." He shook his head again, his grip tightening. "What's on my mind is that if I hadn't picked up that damn phone when I did, who the hell knows how far they would have taken it." Valerie studied him for a long moment, the sharp lines of his face illuminated by the glow of passing streetlights. "But you did pick up," she reminded him. "And you handled it." His lips pressed into a thin line. "Handling it isn't enough, Ma." His voice was rough with frustration, with something deeper, something heavier. "Those men, Wilkes, Reynolds, they walked into that bank with their minds already made up about you. They didn't see a woman withdrawing money from her own account. They saw someone who didn't belong, and that was enough. And the worst part? They didn't even think twice about it. How many other people have they done this to? How many others didn't have someone who could make a call and shut it all down?" Valerie sighed, turning her gaze toward the city outside, the familiar streets of Atlanta rolling past like memories she hadn't had time to process yet. She knew Marcus wasn't wrong. She knew that for every injustice that got corrected, there were 100 more that went unseen, unheard, unchallenged. She had lived it. She had survived it. But she had also learned long ago that anger alone wouldn't fix anything. "They'll get what's coming to them," she said after a moment, her tone even. "They already are." Marcus scoffed, shaking his head. "Losing their badges isn't enough." Valerie glanced at him. "And what would be enough, Marcus?" His jaw tensed. "Prison. A full conviction. No deals, no reduced sentences, no misconduct charges that let them walk away in a few years and get hired at some other department." His voice hardened, his anger simmering just beneath the surface. "I want them to know what it feels like to be powerless. To lose everything. Just like they've done to so many others." Valerie was quiet for a moment, watching him, studying the way his shoulders remained rigid, the way his knuckles had gone white against the steering wheel. There was something deeper at play here, something more than just justice. This wasn't just about her. "Marcus," she said, her voice softer now, gentler. "This isn't just about those cops, is it?" He didn't answer right away. His lips pressed together, his eyes still locked on the road, but she could see the conflict flickering beneath the surface. Finally, he exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "I'm tired, Ma," he admitted, his voice lower now, almost vulnerable. "I'm tired of seeing this happen over and over again. I'm tired of knowing how many people get crushed by a system that was never meant to protect them. And I'm tired of knowing that no matter how much I fight, it's never enough. Valerie reached over, resting her hand lightly over his. I know, baby, she murmured. But you can't let that eat you up inside. You did what you could tonight. And that's more than most people ever do. Marcus let out a slow breath, his shoulders relaxing just slightly under her touch. It's not enough, he repeated, but the edge in his voice had dulled just a little. Valerie squeezed his hand before pulling back. Maybe not, she admitted. But it's something. The rest of the drive was quiet, but not the kind of silence that felt suffocating. It was the kind of silence that held weight, that carried unspoken words and unresolved thoughts, but also understanding. When they finally pulled up to her house, Marcus turned off the engine but didn't move to get out right away. Instead, he ran a hand over his face, exhaling sharply. I want to be there when they get booked, he said suddenly. I want to see it. Valerie studied him carefully before nodding. Then be there, she said simply. His eyes flickered toward her, searching her face for something he wasn't sure he'd find. You don't think I'm taking this too far? She shook her head. I think you need to see it through. A beat of silence passed, then Marcus nodded, decision settling into his bones. I will. And with that, he stepped out of the car, walking his mother to her front door, making sure she was safely inside before heading back to finish what he started. Because some things weren't just about justice. Some things were about making sure that, for once, the people who had spent their lives stepping on others finally felt what it was like to be the ones looking up. The holding cells at the back of the precinct were colder than Wilkes ever remembered. The concrete walls pressed in around him, and the dim fluorescent lights overhead cast an unforgiving glow on the reality he had never imagined for himself. He sat on the metal bench, his head leaning back against the wall, his thoughts spiraling in chaotic loops. His uniform, the one he had worn with pride, was gone. His badge had been stripped from him in front of officers who once looked at him with respect, and now? Now they barely looked at him at all. Reynolds sat beside him, his body hunched forward, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands clasped so tightly together that his knuckles were turning white. He hadn't spoken since they were escorted into the cell. His face was pale, his breathing shallow, and Wilkes could feel the fear rolling off of him in waves. He hated it. Hated seeing Reynolds like this. Hated feeling it himself. I can't go to prison, Reynolds finally muttered under his breath, his voice barely more than a whisper, but in the suffocating silence of the cell, it felt deafening. I can't, man. I won't survive in there. Wilkes swallowed hard, his own throat dry as sandpaper. He wanted to tell Reynolds to shut up, to stop talking like that, to stop sounding like they were already convicted. But the truth was gnawing at the edges of his mind. Marcus Brooks wasn't like the internal affairs officers they had dealt with before. He wasn't the kind of man to let something like this fade into the background. He was going to make sure they paid for everything, and deep down, Wilkes knew they had given him plenty to work with. The door to the holding area creaked open, and both men snapped their heads up at the sound of approaching footsteps. The air shifted. Heavy. Final. Then, Marcus walked in. He didn't rush. He didn't storm in with anger in his steps. He moved with the steady, unwavering confidence of a man who already knew how this was going to end. Behind him, 2 FBI agents followed, their expressions unreadable, their presence a stark reminder that this wasn't just some internal disciplinary action. This was federal. This was real. Marcus stopped in front of the cell, slipping his hands into the pockets of his tailored coat, his dark eyes scanning them both with an eerie calm. Comfortable? He finally asked, tilting his head slightly. Wilkes let out a slow breath through his nose, forcing himself to keep his expression neutral. You got what you wanted, he muttered. So what now? You came to gloat. Marcus arched a brow. You think I enjoy this? His voice was quiet, but there was steel beneath it. You think this is some kind of personal victory for me? He let out a slow, measured breath, shaking his head. Let me tell you something, Wilkes. I don't get satisfaction from watching you sit in that cell. I don't get some sick pleasure out of knowing that you're finally facing consequences. But you know what I do feel? He stepped closer, his eyes narrowing. Relief. Because for once, for the first time in your entire career, you don't have the power to destroy someone else's life just because you feel like it. Wilkes' jaw tightened, but he didn't speak. What could he say? Reynolds, however, was unraveling. His breathing was picking up, his fingers twitching against his knees. Look, he said, his voice cracking slightly, we made a mistake, all right. It was just one bad call. You can't seriously, Marcus laughed, a sharp, humorless sound that cut through the air like a blade. One bad call. His eyes darkened. How many bad calls do you think you made before tonight, Reynolds? How many people sat in that exact spot because of you? How many lives did you ruin and never think twice about it? Reynolds' mouth opened, then closed. His face was ashen. He had no answer. Marcus let the silence stretch, let them sit in the weight of it. Then, his gaze flickered back to Wilkes. You want to know what happens next? Wilkes exhaled sharply, forcing himself to meet Marcus's eyes. Enlighten me. Marcus studied him for a long moment, then tilted his head toward the two agents behind him. We're finalizing the charges as we speak. Civil rights violations, falsifying reports, wrongful arrest. That's just the beginning. You'll be arraigned in federal court within the week. And since this case has already caught media attention, you can bet that every major news outlet is going to be watching your downfall. Wilkes' stomach twisted, but he kept his face blank. Marcus continued, his voice steady, unshaken. Your precinct has already started distancing itself from you. You're not officers anymore. You're liabilities. Which means if you think your department is going to back you up, think again. They're cutting you loose to save themselves. Reynolds let out a shaky breath, his head dropping into his hands. Jesus Christ. Wilkes clenched his jaw. He could feel it all slipping through his fingers, everything he had built, everything he thought was untouchable. You're ruining us, he muttered. Marcus arched a brow. No. You ruined yourselves. The words were final, absolute. For a moment, the room was quiet again, the gravity of it all pressing down like an unforgiving weight. Then, Marcus stepped back, slipping his hands from his pockets, his posture still composed, still controlled. I didn't come here to gloat, he said after a beat. I came here to let you know that, for the first time in your lives, you don't get to decide how this plays out. You don't get to twist the narrative. You don't get to rewrite the story. This time, the truth speaks louder than you ever could. With that, he turned and started toward the exit, his agents following close behind. Wilkes sat there, his fists clenching, his breath coming in short, sharp bursts. He wanted to lash out, wanted to fight, wanted to tear something apart. But what was left? Nothing. Reynolds let out another breath, but this time, it was different. Resigned. Defeated. They're really going to put us away, aren't they? He muttered. Wilkes didn't answer. He didn't need to. Because for the first time in his life, he knew what it felt like to be powerless. The sun was beginning to rise over Atlanta, casting long shadows across the city streets. The air was still cool, the city not yet fully awake, but inside the federal courthouse, the energy was charged, electric. Cameras lined the sidewalks, reporters murmuring into microphones, their voices hushed but urgent. The news had spread fast. 2 former police officers, once untouchable, were now at the center of a case that had ignited outrage across the country. Wilkes and Reynolds, the men who had arrested Valerie Brooks on nothing but prejudice and ego, were now being led through the courthouse doors in handcuffs, their faces hard, their jaws clenched tight enough to shatter. Marcus stood on the courthouse steps, his expression unreadable as he watched them being escorted inside. He had seen arrests like this before, but never from this side, never knowing the men in cuffs were the same ones who had spent years getting away with the very thing they were now being prosecuted for. The irony wasn't lost on him. Neither was the weight of this moment. His mother stood beside him, her chin lifted, her posture steady. Valerie Brooks was not a woman who cried easily, and she wouldn't start now, not for them, not for this. There was no victory in watching them walk into that courthouse, not really. The damage they had done couldn't be undone, and the system wasn't suddenly going to change overnight. But this was something. This was the first time in a long time she had seen accountability, real accountability, not just empty promises and meaningless investigations that led nowhere. Marcus exhaled slowly. "You okay?" Valerie didn't look away from the courthouse doors as they swung shut behind Wilkes and Reynolds. "I don't know," she admitted. "I thought this would feel different." Marcus studied her face, the quiet conflict lingering in her eyes. "Different how?" She sighed, her lips pressing together for a moment before speaking. "I thought I'd feel satisfied. Relieved. But it doesn't change what happened." She turned to look at him, her gaze steady. "It doesn't change the fact that there are a dozen more just like them still out there. That this won't be the last time this happens to someone else." Marcus nodded slowly. He understood. He had spent his entire career trying to change things, to root out corruption where he could, to fight the battles that felt impossible. He knew this wasn't the end of anything. But it was something. "You're right," he said after a moment. "It won't be the last time. But this time, they didn't win." Valerie let out a breath, shaking her head slightly. "No," she murmured. "They didn't." A movement caught Marcus's eye, and he turned his head just in time to see someone approaching. James Holloway, the district attorney, was making his way toward them, his expression unreadable, his hands tucked into the pockets of his dark gray coat. He was a man who rarely let emotions dictate his actions, a man who operated within the lines of the law, even when it frustrated him. "Agent Brooks," Holloway greeted, nodding once in acknowledgement. "Ms. Brooks." Valerie met his gaze, her expression unwavering. "Mr. Holloway." He studied them both for a moment before speaking again. "Wilkes and Reynolds are being arraigned as we speak," he said, his voice level, professional. "They'll be formally charged with falsifying police reports, civil rights violations, and wrongful arrest." His eyes flickered toward Marcus. "Federal charges are still pending, but if convicted, they're looking at serious time." Marcus nodded, his face unreadable. "And their defense?" Holloway sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose briefly before responding. "They're playing the misunderstanding card. Their lawyers are arguing that there was no racial bias, that they were just responding to a call from the bank, that they acted within the bounds of their duty." His jaw tightened slightly. "But we have the recording. And we have witnesses. Their own words will be what buries them." Valerie's eyes darkened slightly, but she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Marcus could feel the storm of emotions swirling beneath her composed exterior. Holloway exhaled, shifting his stance slightly. "I know this won't undo what happened," he said after a beat. "But this case is going to set a precedent. You understand that, don't you?" Valerie nodded once, her voice quiet but firm. "I do." Holloway studied her for a moment longer, then turned his attention back to Marcus. "I'll keep you updated," he said. "Expect this to move fast." Marcus shook his hand once, firm and brief. "I'll be watching." Holloway nodded before stepping away, disappearing back into the courthouse, leaving Marcus and Valerie standing there in the morning light, the city stirring around them. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Then, Valerie sighed, rubbing her arms lightly as if trying to shake off the weight of the last 24 hours. "Let's go home, Marcus." Marcus hesitated, his gaze lingering on the courthouse for just a second longer before finally nodding. "Yeah," he murmured. "Let's go home." They turned away from the courthouse steps, away from the flashing cameras and murmuring reporters, away from the weight of what had happened. But the echoes of it would remain, reverberating far beyond this moment, far beyond these men, far beyond this case. Because justice wasn't just about this one victory. It was about what came next. The courtroom was silent, the kind of silence that carried weight, thick with anticipation, with consequence, with the undeniable reality that nothing would ever be the same again. Wilkes and Reynolds sat at the defense table, their suits pressed but their bodies stiff, their faces drained of the arrogance they once carried like armor. The trial had been swift, faster than either of them had expected. The evidence had been overwhelming, the testimonies damning. Victims they had long forgotten, people they had written off as insignificant, had taken the stand, their voices strong, their words cutting through any weak defense the lawyers had tried to construct. Their abuses weren't just isolated incidents. They were patterns, deeply ingrained, habitual. And now, for the first time in their lives, those patterns had consequences. The judge's voice rang through the courtroom, clear and absolute as she read the verdict. Guilty. On all counts. Wilkes' hands clenched into fists, his nails digging into his palms as a cold sweat formed on his brow. The reality of what awaited him settled in, heavy and unforgiving. Prison. Not just for a few months. Years. Decades, even. He had walked into that bank, so sure of his authority, so certain that his badge was an untouchable shield, and now, that same blind confidence had led him here. To chains. To a sentence he had handed out to so many others without a second thought. Reynolds barely moved, his eyes empty, hollowed out by the realization that his life, everything he had built, everything he thought he was gone. There would be no appeal strong enough to undo this. No department to quietly reinstate them. No favors to call in. The system that had once protected them had spat them out the moment they became liabilities. They were no longer officers. They were criminals. And the world would never see them any other way again. Across the courtroom, sitting with an air of composed dignity, Valerie Brooks watched without a word. She didn't celebrate. She didn't smile. This wasn't about revenge. It never had been. It was about accountability, about something resembling justice in a world where it so often failed to exist. And as she felt Marcus' reassuring presence beside her, she knew they had done something that mattered. Not just for her. But for every name, every face that had been lost in silence. Outside the courthouse, cameras flashed, microphones were shoved into Marcus' face as reporters fired off questions. How did he feel about the verdict? Was this a step toward real change? Did he believe this would make a difference? He answered with the precision of a man who had spent his life choosing his words carefully, but there was something deeper beneath his responses, something unspoken. This wasn't the end. It was just one battle in a war that stretched far beyond this case, far beyond his mother's experience. The system was still broken. The work was far from over. Valerie stood beside him, calm, composed, but when the cameras turned away, when the crowd began to disperse, she placed a hand on his arm, grounding him. "You did good, baby," she murmured, her voice warm, steady. "You did real good." Marcus exhaled slowly, looking at her, taking in the quiet strength she carried, the grace that had never faltered, not even in the face of humiliation, of injustice, of everything they had tried to do to break her. He nodded, his jaw relaxing just slightly. "So did you, Ma." That night, as they sat together at her kitchen table, the weight of it all still settling in, Valerie poured them both a drink, just a little bourbon, something smooth, something earned. They clinked their glasses together, a quiet acknowledgement of everything they had survived. "You ever gonna let yourself breathe, Marcus?" she asked after a moment, studying him. He smirked slightly, shaking his head. Maybe when the world stops giving me reasons to fight. Valerie smiled knowingly. That day ain't coming anytime soon. He sighed, running a hand over his face. I know. But that don't mean you can't live in between the fights, she reminded him, her voice gentle but firm. You did what you had to do. Now take a moment to be proud of that. Marcus held her gaze for a long moment before nodding. Yeah, he murmured. I will. Because justice wasn't about one moment. It wasn't about one case. It was about the fight that never really ended. But tonight, at least, they had won. And that was something worth holding on to. And now, let's talk about what this story really means. How many times has injustice gone unchecked? How many people have suffered in silence, without someone to step in and fight for them? Valerie's story wasn't just about her. It was about a system that has failed too many for too long. But it was also about power, the power of refusing to stay silent, the power of holding people accountable, the power of fighting back, even when the odds are stacked against you. Would Wilkes and Reynolds have faced consequences if Marcus hadn't stepped in? Probably not. And that's the real issue. Justice shouldn't depend on who you know, on whether or not you have someone powerful in your corner. It should be a given. But too often, it isn't. So let me ask you, what would you have done in Valerie's place? How would you have fought back? And more importantly, what can we do as a society to make sure stories like hers don't keep happening? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Let's talk about it. And if you want more stories like this, stories that challenge, stories that make you think, stories that bring truth to light, make sure you subscribe to Tales of Twist. There's always another story waiting to be told.